I understand the next call is a split call. Porter Williams, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. ACC, Mr Speaker, was set up as a no-fault, no-blame system. It's a system where is the envy of the world, and that we are able to ensure that should we have an accident that means that we're incapacitated, we're unable to continue to earn an income, a living, that we actually have the ability to not only have treatment but to be rehabilitated back into work. But ACC also has another function, Mr Speaker, and that is around education and supporting the prevention of accidents into the future. And I think that that's part of the argument that hasn't been highlighted today, Mr Speaker, because we have concentrated on the notion that ACC will continue to balloon out of all proportion, collecting funds. Actually, ACC has a really significant role in supporting good and safe practices, particularly at work. Good safe practices in terms of our sport and our leisure. Sometimes good safe practices in saving us from ourselves. But Mr Speaker, there is a role in ACC to support that. We have spoken a lot about the oversubscription to some accounts through the levies, and we cannot deny that that's happened. 140% of some accounts oversubscribe. Now that means that employers have been charged, and employers have spoken to me about this in my own electorate when I've been doing visits to businesses, about the cost of ACC. The cost of ACC to business can sometimes become quite prohibitive. So why is it that we continue with a system that promotes this oversubscription to some of these accounts, which actually damages the ability of businesses to perform as well as they can? We do have to look at covering the cost of future liabilities going into the future, but do we have a mechanism that actually adequately monitors these future liabilities, given the face of not only increased technological advances, which means that we could potentially be safer with examples around, say, for example, the use of airbags in cars, that we can potentially be safer. Technology has a big role to play in this, and as much as education does, Mr Speaker, as I have said. But it does speak to having an overall look at the general health and well-being of our communities, and that must include the health and safety practices of our businesses. And we have had a shocking few years, I must say, Mr Speaker. We have had also legislation come to this House which could have improved the health and safety of workers should the plans have gone through as we had expected. But what has happened is that classification and categories of risk have gotten in the way of identifying where we can make adequate and good advances in health and safety practices for our workplaces. Now that goes hand in hand with what happens around ACC, what happens with the levies that we are going to charge into the future. And I'm concerned, Mr Speaker, about the risk, the classification and the categorisation that has spilled over into this legislation, as my colleague Ms Moroney spoke of before, where classifications of vehicles, for example, the data that was collected via the Australian work has tried to be forced into a New Zealand context and actually has made a mockery of safety classifications. And we've seen that happen in our health and safety legislation, and we are seeing it again in this piece of legislation around ACC. Mr Speaker, I just want to say that we should all be striving to reduce the level of accidents and increase the safety in all of our activities, and thereby we can, in the future, hopefully reduce levies to employers and as a cost of business to the country. Thank you, Mr Speaker.